Thank you, Nalini. And our last but not least presenter, Dr. Ruth McRoy.
Good morning. I dream a world in which African American children are no longer disproportionately represented in our nation's child welfare system. This is something that I have been focused on for a long time. It all began some years ago when I was in the process of doing some training for the police force in Austin, Texas. And in order to be better prepared to train them in diversity issues and to get them aware of some of these kinds of things, we agreed that I would go out on some of the investigations with officers, along with social workers, once there had been a report of neglect or abuse. When I accompanied them, many of the homes that we went to were those of African American families. When I saw what was being said, what was being asked, the decisions that were being made about removing a child, when I saw children, often sibling groups, that were crying and begging and pleading, "Don't take us away, we're okay." But still the decision was that they would be removed, taken away, and many of these children, when they were being removed, went to different homes. I saw them crying and begging and pleading, "Can't we be together?" But 2 children going over to this home and another 3 going over to another home with another 1, and none of these were close by. And just watching that led me to really want to investigate it further. And in so doing, I learned about a case in the state of Tennessee. It was called the Brian A. case, in which children's rights investigated what was going on in the state of Tennessee, because over half of the children that had been removed from their homes, over half of the children that had been removed as a result of neglect or abuse, were African American. And there was a lawsuit against the state to investigate that. I was brought in for the purpose of trying to explore, interviewing families, talking with all of those involved in the process. And more than anything, I really became compassionate about trying to figure out, what can we do to change this? How can we really have a world in which African American children are no longer disproportionately being removed from their families? And the reality is that many of these children are being removed for reasons of poverty. Neglect comes about as a result, often, of poverty. Yes, there are cases in which there is different forms of abuse, but many of these were neglectful situations. What was happening? In looking into it more so, we began to recognize that although African American children represent about 14% of the U.S. child population, they represent about 23% of the 434,000 children in the nation's foster care system, with the latest data in 2016. What does that mean? They also represent about 23% of those that are waiting to be adopted. Again, those children represent 14% of the nation's population of children. White children represent about 51% of children in the U.S. child population, yet 44% of those children that are in foster care and those waiting to be adopted, that would be considered underrepresentation. What can we do to look at this issue? What can we do? What can we do to keep children from having to be removed from their families and placed in care? I dream a world in which they're no longer disproportionately represented in the child welfare system. I dream a world that if they're removed from their families are given some form of support and resources to enable them to be safely returned to their family in a timely way. I dream a world in which children who have been removed don't end up having to be placed multiple times, because with each child placement, they often are going to a different school, to a different neighborhood. Everything is different. I read a case recently in which a child had been moved 22 times. What does that mean when we think about it? What can we do to help children achieve permanency of not being able to be returned to their homes, to be placed in kinship care with relatives, to be placed formally in adoption, but often to be still have, if safe, to have those contacts with their family members? I think about a child and what it's like for that child to know and to be worried and to be thinking about how on earth I'll get back home to my family, not understanding what this removal was all about. What can we do? What are some of the strategies? How can we teach about those strategies? How can we not only teach about them, but implement those strategies to make a difference? What's being done? There are a variety of different projects that have been underway in different communities. Of course, many of you may be familiar with the Family to Family initiative that was initiated by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Other projects, sort of like Point of Engagement down in Southern California, LA County, for the purpose of not only just coming and removing a child, but at the time they're there to pick up the child. It's not just the police, it's not just the worker there, but there are those who can help the family, can partner with the family. For example, knowing that there may be, I'll give you a case example in which a family, it looks like the father very likely to be having had trouble, a recent case of family in which the father had been returned from the criminal justice system. He was at home, was wanting to get a job. There was no position for him, but the agency partnered with another one that helped him get training to get a job, to do something to enable this child to be back home after being removed for reasons of neglect due to poverty. What can be done? Team decision-making, instead of just one worker making a decision. Having a group of people representing perhaps different agencies. There are new initiatives that include involving parents as partners. Parents as partners, meaning other parents whose children have been removed in the past, who have learned, experienced, and had this knowledge now about some suggestions about how to help the family, partnering with them. Some states are considering that particular model. Trying to find strategies to facilitate the return of children to their families. Trying to find strategies to decrease the likelihood of children remaining in care for long periods of time, finding strategies that are successful, finding strategies that will reduce this. But that still doesn't get at the issue of the overrepresentation. I dream a world in which that is being addressed. And one thing that is being considered for this these days is predictive analytics. Predictive analytics has been explored and recently implemented in Pittsburgh, Allegheny County. They found that 8 out of every 1,000 Black children were placed outside their home that year, compared to 1.7 of every 1,000 white children. They decided we need to look at issues of decision-making. What factors are being taken into consideration? After 16 months of using a strategy called Predictive Analytics as the family screening tool, they found that Black and white families were being treated more consistently based on their risk scores than before the program's introduction. They found that in just entering information into a database about a family, they found that the number of Black families being investigated dropped from nearly half before the program began. It dropped to about 1/3. They found that as a result, caseworkers weren't spending so much time investigating well-functioning families who were then being hassled in a way by intrusive government agencies and having all these calls being made and kids being removed and that kind of thing. They found that the families were treated more consistently. They found that looking at risk scores made a difference. Finding a system that is not incorporating what we have to call out as bias that many persons have in looking at and making those decisions, bias that is based on race. They found that when that was just a factor entered into an analytic, that there was a big difference. And they found that the kids that were in need of services, the families that were in need of help, were getting it. They also found that those in the past who had been removed, they looked more carefully at some of those families and found maybe there were some other strategies that could have been implemented rather than removing. Given those early results from Pittsburgh, predictive analytics looks like an innovative approach. How can we do more in thinking about this? When we think about family-to-family initiatives, we think about prevention rather than just intervention. What can we do ahead of time rather than after? Once there has been some sort of investigation, when we know that some families may be at risk, how can we use family members as the experts? How can we work towards getting children back home? All of these are important. How can we make the parents partners in this initiative? Parents who have been in the system, have experience, know about resources as well. How can we be sure that workers know all about resources within a community? Because that's one of the challenges as well, to be able to get the proper mental health services that are available, to be able to partner with these families. I dream a world in which we have reduced child and family poverty, when we recognize that poor children are disproportionately exposed to a variety of risk factors, inadequate nutrition, substandard housing, untreated illness, that can affect their cognitive ability, their social, their emotional development. When we know that this can impact outcomes, we recognize it, and we recognize that because the economic well-being of children and their families is inextricably linked, we must have successful practice and policy strategies to address it. I dream a world in which all children have access to healthy, safe, and permanent families. I dream a world in which innovative strategies are being implemented, which address the reasons for the disproportionate representation of African American children in the foster care system. I dream a world in which we are achieving equal opportunity, equity, and justice for all. It's up to all of us. Think about it, because the children are waiting. Thank you.